Welcome, dear friend, to a story that begins in the quiet hours when the world settles into sleep. Tonight we journey into the life of a boy who found his voice not in words, but in the silent language of 64 squares. This is the tale of Bobby Fischer, a name that echoes through the halls of chess history like a whisper in an empty cathedral. Close your eyes and imagine a small apartment in Brooklyn, where the sounds of the city fade into a gentle hum. Picture a 6-year-old boy, his small fingers tracing the wooden edges of a chess set purchased for just $1 from a neighborhood candy store. This moment, so simple and innocent, would set into motion a story that would captivate the world and break a human heart. Bobby Fischer was not like other children. While his peers played in schoolyards and dreamed of baseball heroes, Bobby found his companions in carved wooden pieces that stood in perfect formation before him. His sister Joan would watch, sometimes with wonder, sometimes with worry, as her younger brother would sit for hours, moving pieces across the board in conversations only he could hear. There was something both beautiful and haunting about the way Bobby spoke to his chess pieces. Neighbors would later recall the soft murmur of his voice drifting through thin apartment walls, a boy teaching himself the ancient dance of strategy and sacrifice. His mother, Regina, a brilliant woman struggling to make ends meet, would find him asleep at the kitchen table, his head resting beside the board, small hands still clutching a knight. We might ask ourselves what draws a child so completely into a world of black and white squares. Perhaps it was the comfort of rules that never changed, of a universe where every piece had its purpose, where chaos could be tamed by thought and patience. In Bobby's world, the chess pieces never abandoned him, never left without warning, never disappeared into the uncertainty that marked so much of his young life. As we begin this journey together, imagine that same boy, now grown, standing at the edge of greatness and tragedy. His story will take us from the quiet chess clubs of Brooklyn to the grand stages of international competition, from the heights of world championship glory to the shadows of exile and solitude. It is a story of genius and heartbreak, of a mind that could see moves others never dreamed of, yet could not find its way through the complexities of human connection. In the chapters that follow, we will walk beside Bobby through his triumph and his torment, witness the price of being chosen by destiny, and perhaps understand something deeper about the nature of genius itself. For tonight, let his story be your companion, a gentle voice in the darkness, reminding us that even the greatest among us are, in the end, simply human beings seeking their place in an often bewildering world. So settle back, dear listener, and let us begin where all great stories must, with a child who dared to dream in a language of kings and queens, bishops and knights, in the endless possibilities that live within 64 squares. In the gentle twilight of memory, let us return to that Brooklyn apartment where young Bobby's extraordinary gift first began to bloom. Picture, if you will, the warm glow of evening light filtering through worn curtains, casting long shadows across a kitchen table where magic happened daily. Carmine Nagro was the kind of man who believed in the power of small kindnesses, As president of the Brooklyn Chess Club, he had seen many young players come and go, their enthusiasm burning bright before flickering out. But when he witnessed 7-year-old Bobby Fischer weeping openly after a loss, something stirred in the older man's heart. "He crushed me," the boy had whispered to no one in particular. And in that moment of raw vulnerability, Negro saw not just talent, but a soul that felt every move, every victory, every defeat, with the intensity of a poet. The Brooklyn Chess Club became Bobby's second home, a sanctuary where the clatter of pieces and the quiet concentration of players created a symphony that soothed his restless spirit. Here, surrounded by men who spoke in the language he understood best, Bobby found something he had never known: belonging. Negro would later say that teaching Bobby was like tending a rare orchid. The boy required just the right amount of attention and space to flourish. But even as Bobby's rating climbed and his reputation grew, those who loved him noticed troubling signs. He would arrive early and stay late, analyzing positions with an intensity that seemed almost painful. His meals grew smaller, his conversations shorter, his world narrower. The other children his age became strangers speaking a foreign language, while the chess pieces became his most trusted confidants. One winter evening, as snow fell softly outside the club windows, Negro found Bobby alone, still studying a position from a game that had ended hours earlier. The boy's lips moved silently as he worked through variations, his young face etched with a concentration that belonged to someone much older. "Bobby," Negro said gently, "the pieces will still be here tomorrow." But Bobby looked up with eyes that seemed to hold the weight of countless games yet to be played. "Will they?" he asked. And Negro realized that for this extraordinary child, tomorrow was never guaranteed. The year Bobby turned 13, he played what would later be called the game of the century. Against Donald Byrne, a master 27 years his senior, Bobby wove a combination so beautiful, so unexpected, that spectators gasped aloud when they realized what was happening. But what stayed with those present wasn't the brilliance of the moves. It was the sight of Bobby afterward, sitting alone, replaying the game on his pocket set, while the congratulations swirled around him like distant music. By 16, Bobby had made a decision that would define the rest of his life. School, with its rigid schedules and prescribed learning, felt like a prison to a mind that could calculate 20 moves ahead, but struggled with the simple algebra of human relationships. He dropped out, choosing instead to dedicate himself entirely to the 64 squares that had become his universe. His mother, Regina, watched this transformation with a mixture of pride and concern. She had raised a prodigy, but at what cost? The boy who once laughed at her stories now spoke mainly in chess notation. The child who had once needed bedtime stories now fell asleep analyzing master games. She would find him at all hours, hunched over his board, moving pieces with the devotion of a monk at prayer. Yet there was undeniable beauty in Bobby's dedication. To watch him play was to witness pure artistry, a mind communing with possibilities that existed nowhere else in the world. His opponents would describe the experience as both humbling and inspiring. To face Bobby Fischer across a chessboard was to encounter genius in its rawest, most uncompromising form. As we leave young Bobby in those formative years, let us hold in our hearts the image of a boy who chose to speak in the language of chess because it was the only tongue in which he felt truly fluent. The world was beginning to take notice, and soon, very soon, that notice would become something far more complex and demanding than the simple appreciation of a child's remarkable gift. Imagine, if you will, a chessboard stretching across continents, its squares marked not by wood or marble, but by ideologies and empires. In the late 1950s, as the Cold War cast its long shadow across the globe, young Bobby Fischer found himself unwittingly placed upon this vast board, not as a player, but as a piece in a game far larger and more dangerous than any he had ever studied. The transformation began quietly, as most profound changes do. Bobby was just 15 when officials in dark suits began appearing at his tournaments. Men who spoke in measured tones about cultural exchange and American excellence. They watched him play with eyes that saw not artistry, but ammunition. In their minds, every brilliant combination Bobby crafted was a small victory against the Soviet chess machine that had dominated the game for decades. Picture the scene. A teenager who had spent his life finding solace in the pure logic of chess, suddenly thrust into a world where every move carried political weight. The State Department saw in Bobby something precious, a weapon wrapped in the innocence of youth, an all-American genius who could challenge the intellectual supremacy of the Soviet Union. They began to cultivate him with the care of gardeners tending a prize rose, never realizing they were also planting the seeds of his future torment. The first signs of the pressure appeared during Bobby's 1958 visit to Moscow. Picture a lonely American teenager walking the vast corridors of the Central Chess Club, where portraits of Soviet champions gazed down like stern patriarchs. Bobby had dreamed of this moment, the chance to play where chess was revered as high art. But instead of welcome, he found walls of cold politeness and calculated indifference. When he asked to meet world champion Mikhail Botvinnik, he was told with icy courtesy that such meetings were not possible for guests. That night, in his Moscow hotel room, something broke inside the 14-year-old boy. Hotel staff later reported the sound of furniture being overturned, of a young voice crying out in frustration and rage. Bobby had encountered for the first time the brutal reality that chess, his pure sanctuary, could be poisoned by politics. The pieces he loved so dearly were being used as symbols in a conflict he barely understood. Years passed, and with them came the 1962 Candidates Tournament in Curaçao, where Bobby's worst fears materialized. He watched in growing horror as Soviet players seemed to coordinate their games, drawing with each other while fighting fiercely against non-Soviet opponents. The beautiful game he had devoted his life to was being manipulated like a marionette show, its strings pulled by masters who had never touched a chess piece. Bobby's accusations of Soviet collusion were met with skepticism by the chess establishment, but in his heart he knew what he had witnessed. The boy who had once found perfect order in chess now saw corruption everywhere. Every tournament became a potential battlefield, every opponent a possible agent of manipulation. The paranoia that would eventually consume him began here, in the sunny Caribbean tournament hall where his innocence died. Yet even as the political machinery ground around him, Bobby's genius continued to bloom. His games became more brilliant, more uncompromising. It was as if the pressure was forging his talent into something harder, more luminous. When he swept the 1963-64 U.S. Championship with a perfect 11-0 score, a feat unprecedented in tournament chess, the world took notice. Here was not just talent, but something approaching the supernatural. The Americans celebrated, the Soviets brooded, and Bobby himself remained caught between pride and bewilderment. He had achieved something magical, but the celebration felt hollow. The congratulations came from men who saw his victories as their own, who claimed his genius as a national resource. The boy who had once played simply for the love of the game now found himself carrying the hopes and fears of an entire nation. By 1970, as Bobby demolished his opponents in the candidates cycle with a series of match victories that defied all conventional wisdom, the pressure had reached a breaking point. Henry Kissinger himself called, appealing to Bobby's patriotism with words that would haunt him. This is the world's worst chess player calling the world's best chess player. America wants you to beat the Russians. As we watch Bobby stand on the precipice of his greatest triumph and his deepest tragedy, we might pause to wonder what it costs a human soul to carry the dreams of millions. The boy who had once found peace in the quiet click of chess pieces was about to face the loudest, most scrutinized chess match in history. And in that crucible, something essential in Bobby Fischer would be forever changed. In the summer of 1972, the world's attention turned to a small island in the North Atlantic, where two men would play a game that millions would watch as if their lives depended on the outcome. Reykjavik, Iceland, a city of barely 85,000 souls, became the stage for what newspapers called the match of the century, though those who lived through it would remember it more as a theater of human frailty. Picture Bobby Fischer in those final days before the match, pacing his hotel room like a caged animal. The boy who had once found such comfort in the certainty of chess rules now faced a world where every decision seemed fraught with hidden dangers. His demands grew more elaborate by the day. The cameras must be removed, the lighting adjusted, the chairs examined for electronic devices. To the world, these seemed like the eccentricities of a temperamental genius. To Bobby, they were matters of survival. Across the playing hall, Boris Spassky waited with the patience of a man who had learned to expect the unexpected. The Soviet champion was a gentle soul, a lover of jazz and literature who had never wanted to be a political symbol. Yet here he was, carrying the pride of an empire on his shoulders, facing an opponent who seemed to see conspiracies in every shadow. The first game ended in Bobby's defeat, a stunning loss that sent shock waves through the American delegation. But it was the second game that would define the match, not because it was played, but because it wasn't. Bobby, holed up in his hotel room, refused to appear unless the cameras were removed. The forfeit that followed was seen by many as madness, but those closest to Bobby understood it as something far more calculated and cruel. William Lombardi, Bobby's second, would later reveal the terrible strategy behind the forfeit. It was designed, he said, to plant doubt in Spassky's mind, to make the Soviet champion question whether Bobby would show up for any game at all. This was psychological warfare of the most refined sort, using uncertainty as a weapon sharper than any combination of pieces. But if Bobby thought he was manipulating the situation, he had underestimated the cost to his own soul. The pressure that he created for Spassky reflected back on him tenfold. Hotel staff reported finding him vomiting before games, his body rejecting the stress his mind had chosen to embrace. He would stand at his hotel window, staring out at the grey Icelandic sky, talking to himself in chess notation, as if seeking comfort in the only language that still made sense. Game 6 became the turning point. A moment of chess so beautiful that even Spassky was moved to applaud. Bobby's quiet 2-4 ... QB6 turned what seemed like a lost position into a masterpiece of calculation and artistry. In that moment, watching the world champion applaud his brilliance, Bobby experienced something he had rarely known: pure, uncomplicated joy. For a few minutes, the politics fell away, the paranoia receded, and there was only the ancient dance of minds across 64 squares. Spassky, gracious in defeat, sent a bottle of champagne to Bobby's dressing room with a simple note: to Bobby from Boris. But Bobby, trapped in his world of suspicion, saw only potential poison. He rejected the gesture, telling his handlers that it was KGB poison, unable to accept that his opponent might genuinely respect his artistry. As the match progressed, both men paid a price that went far beyond the prize fund. Spassky began losing weight dramatically, his sleep disturbed by nightmares of endless chess positions. His wife suffered a miscarriage, attributed by the team doctor to extreme stress. Bobby, meanwhile, descended deeper into isolation, memorizing Icelandic phrases to detect coded Russian messages and demanding food tasters before each meal. The final game ended not with the drama of a decisive victory, but with the quiet desperation of a telephone call. Spassky, unable to face another day of the psychological torture that the match had become, called the arbiter and resigned. The words "I resign" echoed through the empty playing hall like a prayer for mercy. Bobby Fischer had won the World Chess Championship, achieving the goal that had consumed his entire life. He was 29 years old, at the peak of his powers, with the chess world at his feet. The American press hailed him as a conquering hero, the man who had brought down the Soviet chess empire. But those who knew him best saw something different in his eyes. Not triumph, but the hollow stare of a man who had won everything and lost himself in the process. As we leave Reykjavik in those final days of summer 1972, with Bobby holding the crystal trophy that symbolized chess supremacy, we might wonder what victory truly means when it comes at such a cost. The boy who had once played chess for the pure love of the game had become a man who could no longer tell where the game ended and the warfare began. And in that confusion lay the seeds of everything that would follow: the silence, the exile, and the long, heartbreaking descent into darkness. After the thunder of Reykjavik came a silence so profound it seemed to echo across the entire chess world. Bobby Fischer, at 29, had reached the summit of his ambition, only to discover that the view from the top was lonelier than he had ever imagined. Picture him in those first days after his victory, holding the crystal trophy that represented everything he had worked for, and feeling empty. The world expected him to reign, to defend his crown, to continue the brilliant career that had captivated millions. Instead, Bobby did something that no world champion had ever done. He simply stopped playing. Not temporarily, not as a strategic pause, but as if some essential part of him had been used up in Iceland and could never be replenished. In the quiet years that followed, Bobby became a ghost haunting his own legend. He moved through Los Angeles like a specter, renting apartments under assumed names, shopping for groceries at odd hours when few people would recognize him. Those who caught glimpses of him described a man who seemed to be hiding not just from the world, but from himself. The chess community waited. Tournament organizers called with offers that would have made him wealthy beyond imagination. Young players dreamed of the chance to test themselves against the master. But Bobby's phone remained silent, his mailbox filled with unopened letters from a world that couldn't understand why their king had abandoned his throne. In 1975, when the chess world demanded that he defend his title against Anatoly Karpov, Bobby presented a list of conditions so extreme they seemed designed to be rejected. He wanted unlimited games. He wanted different rules. He wanted the chess establishment to reshape itself around his fears and obsessions. When they refused, he did the unthinkable. He forfeited his crown without playing a single game. The boy who had once wept when he lost at 7 now walked away from the greatest title in chess without shedding a tear. The world called it pride, stubbornness, madness. But perhaps it was something simpler and more heartbreaking. The action of a man who had given everything to chess and found that chess had nothing left to give him in return. Bobby's wandering years began then, a period of exile both geographic and spiritual. He drifted through countries and cities like a character from a melancholy novel, carrying his pain in a suitcase that grew lighter with each move. In Belgrade, he would appear at chess cafes to play anonymous blitz games, his identity hidden behind a false name and a worn cap, finding brief moments of the joy he had once known. But even these small pleasures were haunted. When recognized, he would flee like a man escaping a crime scene, unable to bear the weight of others' expectations. The genius who had once calculated 20 moves ahead now couldn't plan beyond the next day, the next city, the next escape from his own reputation. Religion found him in those dark years, offering what chess no longer could: absolute answers to absolute questions. The radio sermons of Herbert Armstrong became his new obsession, replacing chess analysis with prophecies of end times and cosmic battles between good and evil. Friends watched in dismay as Bobby's brilliant mind, once focused on the subtle complexities of chess strategy, turned to conspiracy theories that offered simple explanations for a world that had become incomprehensibly complex. The FBI files from this period paint a picture of a man unraveling in slow motion. Neighbors reported him moving furniture at 3 in the morning, protecting himself from infrared surveillance. Former friends received bizarre phone calls where Bobby would speak in code about mind control experiments and electronic harassment. The paranoia that had begun as a rational response to Cold War pressures had metastasized into something that consumed his days and haunted his nights. Yet even in his exile, Bobby remained Bobby Fischer. His understanding of chess was still superhuman, his memory still perfect. In rare moments of lucidity, he would analyze games with the same brilliance that had once amazed the world, only to retreat again into the fortress of his fears when the weight of who he was became too much to bear. Sister Joan, the only family member who never gave up on him, would receive unexpected visits where Bobby would play chess with her children, his face softening with something approaching peace. In those moments, she could see glimpses of the boy she had known, the brother who had once shared that first chess set from the candy store. But the visits always ended the same way, with Bobby remembering who he was supposed to be and disappearing again into his self-imposed exile. As the years passed, Bobby Fischer became more legend than man, more myth than memory. Chess players would speak his name in hushed tones, sharing stories of his genius that grew more extraordinary with each telling. But the man himself remained hidden, a king in exile from his own kingdom, carrying the weight of unfulfilled promises and unanswered questions. In the silence of those years, perhaps Bobby found something that had always eluded him, peace from the endless pressure to be extraordinary. Away from the cameras and the crowds, the expectations and the politics, he was finally free to be simply human. It was a freedom that had cost him everything, but perhaps, in his own way, he had found it was worth the price. In 1992, 20 years after his triumph in Reykjavik, Bobby Fischer emerged from his exile for one final act that would define the remainder of his story. Yugoslavia was burning with civil war. Sanctions were strangling its economy, and into this chaos walked the former world champion, drawn by the promise of one last match against his old rival Boris Spassky. Picture the scene. A luxury resort in Sveti Stefan, Montenegro transformed into a fortress of chess. The organizers, shadowy figures with questionable motives, had offered Bobby something he couldn't resist, not just money, but the chance to play chess on his own terms, free from the federations and officials who had made his life miserable. It should have been paradise for a man who had dreamed of such freedom. Instead, it became the stage for his final tragedy. The press conference that announced the match will be remembered as one of the most painful moments in chess history. Bobby, his hair now gray, his face lined with years of exile, stood before the cameras and performed an act that shocked even those who thought they knew him. Taking out a letter from the U.S. Treasury Department ordering him not to play, He spat on it with a hatred so pure it seemed to burn the air around him. In that moment, Bobby Fischer ceased to be just a chess player and became something else. A fugitive from his own country, a man who had chosen his art over his citizenship. The boy who had once been America's great hope in the Cold War had become its enemy, and the transformation was complete. The match itself was both beautiful and heartbreaking. Bobby's chess was still brilliant, still touched with the genius that had made him immortal. But watching him play was like watching a master craftsman work with tools he could no longer fully trust. The moves were there, the combinations still sparkled, but something essential was missing, the joy that had once made his victories feel like celebrations. Spassky, older now and wiser, played with the grace of a man who had made peace with his past. He had come not for victory but for closure, to share one last dance with the partner who had defined his career. Between games, the two former enemies would walk the hotel grounds, speaking in the quiet voices of old men remembering their youth. But even this final gift was poisoned by Bobby's demons. He introduced a new clock system, convinced that traditional timing devices could be manipulated by his enemies. He demanded hand inspections before each game, certain that Spassky might be hiding coded messages in his palms. The beautiful game they were playing was overshadowed by the paranoid theater of Bobby's deepest fears. The money came in gold bars, smuggled through mountain passes by men with no names and dangerous smiles. Bobby accepted it with the desperate gratitude of a man who had been living on borrowed time and borrowed money. But even as his pockets filled with gold, his soul seemed to empty further. When the match ended, Bobby had won, though it hardly seemed to matter. The real consequences began. American agents waited at airports, warrants were issued, and Bobby Fischer, world champion, became Bobby Fischer, international fugitive. The country that had once celebrated him as a hero now hunted him as a criminal. The years that followed were a blur of safe houses and false names, of midnight flights and desperate escapes. Bobby aged rapidly, his health failing, his mind retreating deeper into the fortress of conspiracy theories that had become his only companions. The man who had once seen every possibility on a chessboard now saw enemies in every shadow, betrayal in every kindness. Yet still, he played chess, alone in hotel rooms and rented apartments, moving pieces on a board that existed only in his mind. The 64 squares that had been his first home remained his last refuge, the one place where the world still made sense, where cause and effect followed rules he could understand. In 2005, after years of running, Bobby found asylum in Iceland, the same country where he had achieved his greatest triumph. It was a fitting circle, a return to the scene of his glory and his undoing. But by then, he was more ghost than man, more memory than presence. The final years were marked by increasing isolation and declining health. Bobby's body was failing, but his pride remained intact. When doctors recommended treatment for his kidney disease, he refused, convinced that hospitals were part of the conspiracy that had haunted him for decades. The genius who had once calculated countless possibilities couldn't see the simple truth that his stubbornness was killing him. On January 17th, 2008, in a small apartment in Reykjavik, Bobby Fischer died alone, clutching a chess piece. A king, some said, though others claimed it was just a pawn. The man who had brought chess to the masses, who had made the ancient game a symbol of human possibility, was gone. At his funeral, Boris Spassky wept openly, mourning not just a friend, but an entire era. They had been young men once, playing a beautiful game in a complicated world. They had been used by forces beyond their control, celebrated and reviled in equal measure. In the end, they were just two human beings who had loved chess more than anything else, and paid the price that such love demands. As we reach the end of Bobby's story, perhaps we can find in it not just tragedy, but also a kind of strange triumph. He had lived on his own terms, however painful those terms might have been. He had refused to compromise his vision of what chess should be, even when that refusal cost him everything. And in his games, those brilliant, immortal games, he had left behind something that no amount of suffering could diminish: pure beauty, captured forever in the movements of pieces across a board. Rest now, Bobby Fischer. The games are over, the battles fought, the long exile ended. In the quiet of this final moment, perhaps you have found at last the peace that eluded you in life, the simple joy of a child discovering chess for the first time, forever and always.